Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
Well, you got a new background.
I was sitting still for you, hoping you were going to comment on it.
Yeah, I thought it was just your thumbnail there for a minute.
Right. Well, I'm just practicing for next turkey season because maybe, maybe I just didn't sit still enough this turkey season to have it go the way that I wanted to. So I better start, practicing my calling and sitting still right now.
Yeah, you got to rule out all the all the potential contributors. Yeah. Well, we've had a pretty good run of episodes here.
Mm-hmm.
Several in a row, including, this last week that we had the Tennessee bunch on here.
Yeah. It's kind of similar to what we did around this time last year, and that we kind of explored all the different facets over the past several weeks of, potential links between male harvest and turkey reproduction, because that seems to be at the forefront of the discussion right now. There's several states that have recently changed their season frameworks, particularly, the start date. And there's some that are, in the process of trying to change it again right now. So we wanted to thoroughly explore this topic and get to the bottom of, well, what do we have out there and what are we seeing in response to some of this?
Yeah. Well, I could see, based on comments online, there were some people that didn't like what they heard, and there were other folks that were glad to hear it. Mm-hmm. Some that were happy that we were willing to share it. I don't think a lot of people realize that, we're trying to chase data.
Yeah.
And sometimes I don't like it.
Well, I think one thing that is confusing to a lot of people is that they have become under the impression that there are, published data out there that link different aspects of male harvest to productivity. And the reason that's significant is the declines that we're seeing in populations, sometimes indexed by harvest, sometimes indexed by other factors, are going down. And in most states, that seems to be linked to productivity. Mm-hmm. So the thought process is, if the way that we harvest the bird influences productivity, we should change the way that we harvest the bird. But on that note, to be fully clear on this topic, there has still, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there is still no published study that I can think of that has shown an influence of harvesting males on turkey productivity.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, that does not exist.
Right.
So another thing you said that I would like to be very clear on, we've talked about this. I even brought it up on the last episode because you make a strong point about this commonly, that we use harvest data as an indicator of what's going on in populations, and sometimes that seems circular because, the answer seems to be, if we're harvesting more, we're harvesting too many. Mm-hmm. And if we're harvesting less, the population is declining.
Right.
But we went through several reasons why it's probably a good indicator on some level, but it has lots of problems.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And, the Tennessee folks, they use the Breeding Bird Survey, which is an independent data set, and that confirmed, and I believe they have this published in the paper. We still are waiting on it has been accepted for publication, but it's not yet available to scientists. So if it becomes available, we will link it here. but I believe they published that figure as part of that study, so we'll put it in here if it's available.
Yeah, so the student's thesis is published. The preprint of the accepted article has been published.
Yeah,
What we have not seen is the final draft from the publisher yet.
right.
But it's been
Which may
fully
be
through the process.
right, and it's probably been revised because when you go through the peer review process, your peers that are serving as reviewers challenge things and ask that the authors make changes so that it's more supported by the data presented and the analyses are stronger and it meets the rigor of peer review.
Right.
They may not match, well, they almost certainly don't match
Right.
what's in the thesis or even what's in the preprint because
Right.
the paper can change quite a bit, including the analyses presented and things, because if reviewers find problems with it, then the authors have to change those to suit that.
Yeah, but I think one thing that's important to be clear about right now is that, we've talked to Dr. Harper and Bueller, and they've gotten those revisions in, and the main conclusions of the paper did not change.
Yeah,
So,
what they shared on the air is
Yeah.
what has been accepted for
Exactly.
publication.
Exactly.
So my point of bringing that up is I'm not sure if the breeding bird survey data made it into the paper or not,
Right.
but we have seen the analysis that they performed, and it pretty clearly shows that in Tennessee, based on those data that are independent of other data sets that we might use, show a pretty stark decline in turkeys over the past decade or so.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So
there is reason for concern in some states.
Sure. But yeah, now we've seen data from Tennessee, and we made it very clear, during that last week's episode, that was probably the most well-designed experiment that's ever been done on turkeys. They, had controls in place to isolate every factor of interest the way that thing was designed. They had an outstanding sample size. And I think another thing that's important to point out, because we've seen some discussion around this point online, is that they moved the season back about as far as you could if you were trying to be maximally conservative with this hypothesis. And what I mean specifically by that is they moved it back to, it was like within days, I think, right? It was within days of like what their peak and incubation should be across the state.
Yeah.
And moving it to that peak and incubation was the most conservative measure that I'm aware of that anyone has suggested. And particularly, you think about the Isabelle paper that we've discussed several times on here, and it said that, kind of a moderately conservative approach would be to wait to start the season until most hens have initiated their nest, so that we know that they've been bred. And then an even more conservative approach would be to move it to when most hens are sitting on the nest. And that's basically what Tennessee did. They were still a few days before that, but they were right there at it. So I think that was important, because I think that represents the most conservative measure, if this hypothesis is true, that a state would likely implement to try to reverse declines.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I do want to reiterate also, you said it was long-term, large data set. It's also manipulative.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really important because you have a control simultaneously monitoring how things just fluctuate in populations side by side with your treatment. So now you're going to have the the light problems.
Yes, I've got the lights timing out like you usually do.
Yeah. So that is really important, and that's why we keep saying it. I mean, this is the only study that I'm aware of at the population level that's at a spatial and temporal scale with a manipulation like this in turkeys.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah,
mean, and we have to go with the data. That's what
Right.
we are, scientists, and that is as rigorous as has ever been done on the species for any topic. And they measured all of the metrics that I could think of, and they did not find compelling information on any of them that there was a change.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I would say that it was pretty compelling that there isn't a change. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, the mean even changed in the wrong direction,
Right.
although it was never statistical. But there were multiple metrics like the timing one where they were talking about if you look at only initial nest, later nests were actually more successful than early nests.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that trended literally the wrong way.
Yeah. So we're not seeing a problem with low nesting participation, right?
Yep,
Hens are
that's right.
attempting like at the rate that they should be.
Hmm.
Hatchability is where it should be. So we're not, having a failure at the fertilization step. Eggs are getting fertilized, and we're not seeing the timing of nesting or incubation change at all either. The only hypothesis that I've heard that hasn't been directly addressed yet related to season timing or season frameworks is that somehow by hunting when we might be selectively removing males that have superior, genetics, for lack of a
Hmm.
better term, like whatever that means. What are superior genetics? People throw that term around all the time, um, and without defining what it means. But maybe it means like, they've got a survival benefit or they reproduce more for whatever reason. I
Yeah.
mean, that's how selection works. Um, so we haven't been able to address that yet. I don't know that we ever will. But when I hear that in most states we're only killing 20 to 30% of the males every year, leaving 70 to 80%, that is not, in my mind, as a biologist, that's not nearly a strong enough artificial selection to alter gene frequencies in a free ranging wild population.
Well, I mean, we had two people on who are evolutionary ecologists. That's what they study,
Right,
and they both said that.
right. So you
So,
layer the Tennessee study, which I think it's in a league of its own. But then we've also heard about data from Mississippi and even Georgia with not quite as drastic of season changes and not all of necessarily the research methods in place to intensively monitor the response of turkeys as in the Tennessee study, but neither of those studies found any trends that would indicate that moving the season helped with increasing poult per hen ratios either. So now we're at a point where we've kind of got either direct scientific or at least anecdotal evidence from a number of states that season frameworks aren't affecting reproduction, and we add to that all the discussion that we've had over the past several weeks about the potential mechanisms of the reproductive ecology of turkeys that make it likely that they can compensate for those losses during the breeding season. And it's just this hypothesis that season timing is affecting reproduction just continually diminishes in its probability of being accurate.
I'd say that's fair.
Did I just like come to our conclusion already? I didn't mean to I didn't mean to do that 12 minutes in, but it just seemed
Well, I
like
mean, our strongest experiment to date shows that you're right. No effects, and it was long term. I mean, it was 3 years post, and in fact, the third year was the worst out of the whole bunch after the season dates were moved.
mhm,
We've got Mississippi. We talked about their reproduction mirrored Tennessee's and North Carolina's. We know about those at least, and their seasons are really early comparatively relative
mm,
to the biology of the animal.
yeah,
March 15th.
and they're still seeing
Uh,
increases in reproduction right now.
yeah, their reproduction peaked after the harvest was the highest, at least in the recent
Mhm.
past. That's something that's curious to me. 2021 in particular seemed to be a banner year across the board, and that was one of the highest harvests across the board.
Yeah, so
2020 and 2021.
yeah, so 2020 harvest was exceptionally high, but across many states where turkeys are declining, the following year had a really great poult per hen ratio.
Yeah, that to me sounds a lot like density dependence.
Yeah, it does. Well, and
So
if you remember too, um, Craig and Dave noted several times during the podcast when we recorded with them that in the declining counties, fecundity was always higher throughout the study, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they thought that that was because the population has been reduced down to a point where, there's more resources available per individual. That's density dependent. So it's consistent
Yeah.
with your hypothesis.
Yeah. And I know that Lindsay, the former PhD student, is working on this as part of her dissertation. I'm pretty
Right.
confident. Dave said that. I think that they are doing a formal analysis to evaluate density dependence in that population.
That would be awesome.
Yeah, so we're going to have them back on if they produce that for sure.
So you brought up the Mississippi example as they're hunting earlier than everybody else in the South pretty much now. And they've seen some, recent increases in reproduction.
I'm really
But
curious to see if you're going to go where I was just about to go.
on the flip side of that, we have states that have been doing it right, so to speak, if they're trying to adjust season frameworks around this season date hypothesis, right?
Yep.
So we talked about Missouri last summer as kind of the poster child for following all the rules of this hypothesis.
Yeah, everybody or all the rules changes are trying to get to where they are.
Right.
And
but
have been for several decades.
Sure. But my point is they start hunting them late. They don't hunt in the afternoon. They've got a conservative bag limit. And they have been seeing the same declines that everyone else is seeing. So that in and of itself makes me think that this hypothesis doesn't hold a lot of water. But now, they haven't changed like everyone else has been changing, but they're seeing the same upticks in reproduction.
Yep. Very curious. So, yeah, I mean, the states seem to be tracking one another, at least nearby states are tracking each other in productivity, regardless of the season frameworks, and bag limits, and all that. Also, I mean, the biology of the animal. We talked about with the Krakauer multiple paternity.
Right.
There's potentially several. I guess he said there was at least 3 in one or 2 instances that he observed where there's 3 males represented at least. He wasn't detangling brothers from one another.
Yeah.
But at least 3 unrelated males reported in one nest. But it was common for there to be at least 2 unrelated males.
Right.
And then the sperm storage part. The females, I mean, even Lovett Williams back in the day wrote in his book that they could store sperm for up to 56 days.
Right.
That if there is breeding going on before the season is initiated, which is likely even in the early seasons, the sperm storage is a great mechanism for the species to deal with male loss during breeding season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it absolutely is. And then I think it's also important to layer on top of that, just thinking about it from a physiological perspective. Some people were dubious as to whether or not even all males were even fertile, right? We're capable of fertilizing clutches during the breeding season. And our data from Alabama clearly shows that all adult males are. And we even have data showing jakes producing sperm. And then if you go, that's been replicated, or I guess we replicated earlier results from Texas that show that, it takes a little while. You got to get a little while into the nesting season, but jakes were fertile there as well. So this adds up to there being many ways that turkey populations can compensate for male mortality during the hunting season. And I think that was kind of the overall gist of the message I got when we had our conversation with Dwayne Elmore about whether or not turkeys are a lekking species and what does that even mean and what are the reproductive characteristics and what are the population dynamics that are shared among all these different species that lek, regardless of where they are on that lekking spectrum. Is that they're very conspicuous. They're out in open areas. They're making a lot of noise. They're being very flashy and showy. So it makes sense if that species is not going to go extinct, They've got to have a way of compensating for high male mortality during the breeding season.
Well, that was a common characteristic of all those things. Like their males are most vulnerable during breeding,
Yeah.
not just from predation, not
Yeah.
just from hunter harvest, but also because of male conflict.
Right.
So
Yeah, I didn't even bring that up.
yeah, so they still do that, right?
Yeah.
If it hasn't been selected against in the
Yeah.
populations, and they're still viable populations. So that is an interesting thing. And he noted in his episode too that he thought it was a stretch.
I think one thing that we have never discussed on here that is important to bring up at this juncture, and it's something that I hadn't even thought about until recently, like as in the past several days, is when you see this topic discussed relative to season timing and turkey hunting in the spring, the vast majority of the literature that you see cited to support it is from the era of restocking or almost immediately after restocking efforts were concluded. And so, number one, these biologists were, they didn't have the tools and technology that we have today to understand turkey populations. And even in spite of those, I don't know that we really know that much more about turkeys than they did. But the more important point that I wanted to make is the writings that are being referenced where they were thinking about the importance of season dates and male harvest and how that may affect reproductive ecology of the animal and translate into, you know, population dynamics and vital rates. That was all developed at a time period where they were trying to be ultra conservative and, back to my earlier point, knew very little about the overall biology and reproductive ecology of the species, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they were thinking about this from a very different concept or a very different context than we are today, where we have turkeys in 49 states. And in some states, we're killing more than 30,000 birds a year.
Mm-hmm.
Very different context. And it stands to reason that they were being that conservative and thinking about all the potential ramifications of how we hunt and when we hunt. But it's a different
Yeah.
scenario now, and we have more data to go on.
Yeah. Well, even some of those references, the classic ones, those were modeling exercises. They weren't.
Right.
It wasn't that they went and implemented some level of harvest and showed that it wasn't. This is not sustainable, but this is.
No, and I think that's one thing people are confused about is they think that those data exist and they don't.
Yeah. So the other thing that I find interesting is, we talk about the 30% rule. Well, when I went back and looked at one of those papers recently, someone reached out to us and asked a question, highlighting text in it, in one of the Vangilder papers. And, when they were modeling and showing, or they were suggesting the 30%, first of all, it wasn't related to reproduction, it was related to hunter satisfaction. But it was 30% of all males, which includes jakes.
And
So,
yeah.
So
and we're
we've
not
been talking.
we're not near that level.
We've been talking about harvesting 30% of adult males.
Right.
And you're usually less than 10% across the board of the jakes being harvested,
Yeah.
which may be, in many cases, 30 or 40% of the males available, right?
Right.
So I think that's another important thing. I had not read that closely, but when I went back and looked at it, I was like, wow, that they were saying all males,
Right.
not just adult males.
Yeah.
So we're still conservative, I guess is my point.
Right.
With the 30%.
One thing that I'm afraid I may have glossed over too quickly back a few minutes that you brought up is that, essentially what you were saying is that we have more evidence now to show that hens are promiscuous and they breed with multiple males and they do it quite regularly. And that was something that was unknown to those earlier researchers.
Yeah, that's right. Although Lovett did mention that he thought that was happening in one of his books. but they didn't have the tools to confirm that.
That's right.
But that's pretty important. It doesn't seem like it sometimes happens. It seems like it's normal for it to
It's the
happen.
norm, not the exception.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which is important because
Right.
it's another mechanism. You know, I get fascinated about that. And I get questions about it, and I don't have any good answers about this, but I think it is fascinating, and I'm glad people are curious about it. You know, if she's breeding with multiple males, is it like a lottery in there? Like which sperm, you know, which sperm gets which egg?
Well, that's 2 levels of competition, right? And that's something that we've
Yeah,
never really gotten into. So you have the you have the competition, for copulation, right? I'm
yeah.
trying to keep this as professional as possible, but you have the competition for the breeding opportunity, but then if she's breeding with another male, then even after that, the sperm from multiple males competes. I mean, that
Yeah,
happens. It may sound silly, but that happens. I mean, if one male has, better formed sperm that have more energy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go into all sperm morphology because I don't know that much about it, to be honest.
You're the man, though. You're the one
But
that's been looking at them through a microscope.
but it stands to reason, like if she's got all this sperm stored and she releases that to fertilize an egg, the best sperm is going to win, right? So that's another
Sometimes.
that right. Yeah, I mean you can have random. Yeah, the probability
Yeah,
is
they
that
have a higher probability of
yeah,
winning, but that doesn't
it
mean they always win. I think that's important,
absolutely.
though.
Yeah.
You know, we're often people want to hear things in certainty, and they're hearing things in probability and equating to them to certainty often.
Yeah,
It's an instinct of humans
that's right.
for us to assume something is certainty when it's actually a probability.
Yeah. Another thing to keep in mind too is, we talked the female mate choice, right? That came up a lot, and I think female mate choice is one of the keys to the season timing hypothesis, in the sense that you know w- there's some discussion about whether disrupting the dominance hierarchy among males results in the females having to reassess, right?
Mhm.
Um, but gobblers play a role in that too. And specifically, kind of what I'm thinking about is we had a conversation. Man, I'm trying to remember who he brought that up with, or maybe it was just a conversation that you and I had separately off the air. But in some of that Texas work, like by Watson Stokes, they talked about how um, sometimes gobblers, would prevent other adult males from breeding with a hen. So there is female mate choice, but sometimes the gobblers interfere with that female mate choice as well. And you don't always know. Remember, natural selection is not perfect. So just because that gobbler breeds with that hen, that doesn't necessarily mean that his genetics are going to confer the greatest survival and reproduction benefit to that hen and her offspring, right? It was just means that he was able, for some reason, to secure that breeding opportunity. And probabilistically, that means that there's something about him that's better, but
Mhm.
not always, to your point that you just made a minute ago. Maybe he's
Well,
just a better fighter, but maybe the one that he beat actually has a better immune system.
I was just about to say, quality could be conferred in many different ways, and what is quality probably changes as with context as well.
Absolutely.
Like if you're in a population that for whatever reason is challenged by some particular pathogen, then what is best is resistance to that pathogen in that context.
Hmm.
Whereas you go across the river and they don't have that pathogen, but there's some predator that's really important. Well, that could change which traits make quality, right? And then
Hmm.
you could go down the road and there's there's none of those predators or that pathogen, but there's a particular type of vegetation, that's going to bottleneck on poult survival because of temperature. I'm just
Hmm.
making stuff up, obviously, but I'm just showing you like all of those populations would have different selective pressures that make different things quality associated with males.
That's right.
And-
And so, I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's beneficial to have genetic diversity within a population, because as
Yeah.
different situations arise and challenge a
Yeah.
population, you've got potential genetic solutions to all of those.
Yeah.
And
It
so,
increases stability of the population
right,
over
right.
time.
So,
Important concepts.
one of the other questions that's come up quite a bit during the past few days is, okay, you take Tennessee, and they're shifting the season from early April. Let's just simplify things and say early April to mid-April. You think that's an accurate characterization?
Yeah, it
It's
really
close enough.
was the initiation of nests, timing wise. They moved it from the nest initiation phase to the nest incubation phase.
That's right. That's a better way to talk about it. Keep it in biologically relevant seasons.
Yeah.
But one of the questions that we've gotten many times, and I know you have too, because we've both discussed this offline, is what about in a state that starts hunting well before nest initiation? So Tennessee was never doing that, right? So the most
Mm-hmm.
extreme liberal season framework that we could think of would be, to start hunting. Well, I don't want to say extreme liberal. That's a bad way to characterize it, but it's definitely on the opposite end of being conservative, and starting during incubation would be starting well before nest initiation even.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So does any data that we have so far speak to whether or not that is sustainable? And let's just go ahead and come out and be clear with it. Is a March 15th, a mid-March season opening sustainable? Or do we have the data to address that?
The only data that I'm aware of suggests yes, and that is the state of Mississippi.
Right.
Their productivity is tracking everybody else's, and their harvest is tracking everybody else's, and they still open on March 15th, which I think Adam said was 2 or 3 weeks before initiation.
Right.
So, they have been doing that for several decades. Since 1980.
And their harvest, after going down for a period of time, I can't remember the exact time frames, but he said that it's been coming back up a little bit. Is that right?
Yeah, this year was the highest it's been in 20-something years.
Yeah.
So, but again, that doesn't mean there's the same number of turkeys necessarily.
No.
We have to keep that in context with the harvest stuff. But the productivity was up too, and that's one of the things he attributed to the high harvest this year. Is 2 years ago they had a banner year on reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of 2-year-olds running around.
Mm-hmm.
So, as far as I'm aware, there's no data that's suggesting that it's not sustainable. And then we have Mississippi as the example,
Mm-hmm.
Where the season starts relatively early as it compares to the biology of the animal.
Mm-hmm.
They harvest a lot of birds, and the reproduction is still similar. And in fact, they had the same big years as the other states around them.
One thing, those are all really good points. I think you make a solid argument on that. So, speaking to that variation in regulations, one thing that has frustrated me over the past several months as we've had more and more of these conversations is how little changing season frameworks, or we could use the word regulations instead, influences vital rates. Do you follow me?
Yeah, none of them.
I know. It's like
not even male harvest.
No, it's like we change when the season starts. We change the bag limit. We change decoy regulations. What am I missing?
Same number of males get harvested.
And it's like 30% across the board.
Yeah, isn't that
They're
crazy?
extremes. They're extreme outliers, on either end of that.
Yeah.
but most of them are
Well,
in
and
that
that
30% range.
right, and we're also painting with a broad brush. That doesn't mean that
Mhm.
there isn't a higher percentage area within a state,
Right.
right? But across the board, it is kind of remarkable how stable that is.
Yeah, so, so just from that perspective, why would you expect regulations to have much of an impact on vital rates?
I
Because
mean, we should be glad that that's the case.
yeah,
Now,
yeah, they're
like for
they're
example,
resilient. Yeah, they're resilient
yeah.
to harvest.
Well, and I think the Tennessee guys brought up a really good point when they were talking about the state. Whoever's making the decisions. I know it varies by state. I think it's the commissioners in that state, but they didn't follow to a T everything from the recommendations from that data set that the researchers had because they're
Right.
balancing other things,
Yeah.
including they were thinking about kids.
Yeah.
They set the season so that the kids would be right in that prime time, and I'm
Yeah.
good with that.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
me too.
what I'm getting at is the vital rates seem to be relatively insensitive when you look at across the board, the variation across states, and it allows states to try to balance the biology of the animal with other
Mhm.
considerations. And I think that's a good thing.
I totally agree with you. The one problem that I see with regulations not being linked to particularly like male survival is that in some states, in or maybe in a specific area of a state where a population has reached a critical low, we're trying to change seasons so that we're carrying more males year over year,
Yeah.
right? So that's an
So
important
carry up.
distinction that we've made on here
Yeah.
before. Is there's a difference in trying to alter a season so that fewer males die, so that you have more of them that are still alive next year in a huntable population,
Yeah.
versus
That is not
changing,
related to reproduction.
yeah, versus changing season to try to influence the number of poults surviving each year
Right.
and being recruited into the population. So to that first objective of carrying more males over year after year, so you have more to hunt the following year, that's kind of frustrating because it's like, well, what do we do? Like, how do we maximize male survival so that we do have that carryover?
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's really going to be a challenge to states who decide to pursue that or continue to pursue that is, I mean, maybe you just have to get to a point where regulations are so restrictive in order to influence, male survival, that you start to see a lot of hunters that just aren't as active anymore, right? Maybe
Yeah.
participation goes down. Maybe I don't buy a turkey hunting license next year,
And
but
it may not be because they are losing support. It may be that they don't have the opportunity to participate.
yeah, and that is exactly the kind of thing that a state tries to balance and that they're considering when they're trying to,
Mm-hmm.
think about how they should structure seasons.
Yeah. I think that's important to keep in context. Uh, it's not just we shouldn't, based on the Tennessee data in particular, expect this to be a fix-all to just
Hmm.
move the season or something and that fix everything. But it also speaks to the opposite end of that or the other side of that coin. Uh, moving the season isn't necessarily from a biological sense negative either.
Hmm.
It's not going to hurt, but the
Yeah,
biology of the species. But
I don't think
we're,
so.
we're I mean, we don't have any evidence to suggest it will.
The one thing that we've talked about is maybe, concentrating the bulk of hunting activity during nesting might, result in
Yeah,
increased nest abandonment. We talked about that.
but that's a
Um,
hypothesis that we have no data to support or refute.
that's right. And they hypothetically may have seen some of that if it was in effect in the Tennessee, data set. And they didn't see, you know, obviously they didn't see a decrease in nest success in the delayed counties. And that would have been consistent with that hypothesis.
Yeah, yeah, they didn't see more abandonment or anything.
Right.
Uh, so that suggests that that's one data point that suggests that's not happening.
Right.
But yeah, otherwise, we don't have any data right now to suggest moving it improves or makes things worse either.
Mm-hmm.
So my point is that, there seems to be enough flexibility in a population that you can have other considerations that are not biological that are informing those decisions.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the other things that I definitely wanted to address, because I feel like we'd be remiss if we did not, is we kind of got to the end of the conversation with Craig and Dave, and we started talking a lot about predators,
Yeah.
and folks have picked up on that.
Yeah, I've gotten as many questions about the predator habitat feeding conversation
Mm-hmm.
as anything else about the season date, experiment
Right.
discussion,
Yeah.
which is interesting since people are picking up on those three things and they're not related to the whole purpose of that episode.
Well, I think a
But
lot of what's happening is there's been so much focus on the season timing that folks feel like their hypotheses as to why we're seeing what we're seeing have gone largely unignored, and so they view this as an opportunity. It's like, okay, we've kind of addressed that one, so let's move on
yeah,
and pick up these others and start bringing them to
yeah.
the forefront.
So that was one of our big four, right? One of our big four experiments. The
Yes.
season date was one of those. That one has been addressed, and now we're to
Yeah.
the other
Right.
ones. What I would like to say about the predator habitat discussion. We've had a whole series of episodes on this, right? Talking about the issue here.
Mm-hmm.
We have strong correlative data that suggest either could be an issue.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We know poult rearing cover and nesting cover are limited on the landscape. We have data showing that when hens select some types of cover for nesting, that confers a greater success than if they select other things that are
That's right.
often more widely available. That's
That's
strong
right.
correlative support that habitat is limited and that matters to the vital rates. And in fact, we have two data points that we have pointed out multiple times in that regional study across the South that was looking at nesting across several states.
Mm-hmm.
Two of the study areas in there were managed really well. One in South Carolina, the Webb WMA complex, and the other one, Silver Lake. I think you've reminded me that name
South
enough.
Georgia. Yeah.
Yeah. Both of them are open forest with frequent fire, and they're being managed in a way that is good for turkeys apparently because the nesting success is double the average
Absolutely.
across all the studies.
Yeah.
So we have strong support correlatively that habitat is a problem and that it's success. We also have
I think
support.
it's also important to mention in that habitat context that many species that use similar vegetation communities to turkeys to reproduce in, they are also declining alongside turkeys.
Across the board. I mean, it's all of them, pretty much. So you're right. And some of them share the same predators and some don't.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the other thing where, we have plenty of people that are on the predator side of this issue, and we do have correlative evidence that the predator context has changed. And Craig and Dave were pretty strong on this because of their, their hypothesis. Predation is the leading cause of mortality at each life stage. So that's one data point that's being used. So there are some new predators in the scene, and there are some anecdotes, again, correlative evidence that removing predators can confer some effect on the population. We have better data from the quail literature on that, but for habitat and predator removal.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem still lies that we don't have a manipulative on either to detangle those problems, which we articulated, I think, pretty well, and it's been a popular thing online. When poults don't have cover, they get eaten.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to tell, is it a predator problem or a habitat problem? Because the same outcome happens regardless of which one's the problem. And we do have strong data from multiple points of view showing that they are indeed entangled,
Yeah.
because habitat management that confers better nesting cover also tends to decrease the abundance
Right.
of, and probably the efficiency of, predators.
Yeah.
So that if the context of predators has changed, question is, why has it changed? And if that's linked to habitat, that's still a habitat problem. If it's not linked to habitat, then it's a predator problem. And
Mm-hmm.
we don't have the data to know.
Well, or it may be linked to feeding.
Well, I didn't want to point out that particular issue, but since you brought it up,
I did.
the predator context is, I think we have strong correlative evidence the predator context has changed.
Right.
We don't know what the cause of it is, but we've got some ideas, right?
Yeah.
Like the feeding one, subsidized. We do have some evidence that we're subsidizing several relevant predator species. And I after going through all of that and trying to find all the data we can find on it, I would be shocked if feeding isn't playing an important role in the
Right.
predator context.
Yeah. Yeah. Adding to it. I would go even a step further, I think, or maybe I'm just,
You're trying to make people mad is what you're doing.
No,
here.
I'm not. I'm not. I'm actually trying
No.
to. I'm actually trying to mend fences right now, by saying, no, seriously. I think we have a habitat problem, and I think we have a predator problem. But what we are discussing, and I want to make this clear to people, we're not trying to deny that there's a predator problem. What we are trying to do is to figure out what the best solution to that is.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's where we're in disagreement, is a solution to this problem. We're losing too many turkeys to predators.
Yeah, you can't argue that predation is the leading cause of loss.
Yeah.
That is fact.
It is a fact.
What is not fact is why.
Or what is the most efficient way to address that?
Right, which will be dependent on why it's the problem.
Right.
Like why are you losing turkeys to predators? Because if there's nowhere for them to hide from predators to nest, they're going to get eaten. That's how they get lost.
Or conversely, if that habitat is more conducive to supplementing predator populations, that's going to continue to happen until we change the habitat.
Well, and most recently it was me, but we both have people on both sides of this issue that are scrutinizing us not being willing to say predator trapping is the answer or habitat management is the answer. But it's because we need stronger data to make that claim strong. But what we do have is strong correlative evidence, which is much stronger in habitat than it is on predator control.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to lean towards habitat, especially since the predator context is almost certainly linked to habitat based on data we have showing that when you stop using fire and the system transitions into an alternative state without fire, that it benefits a whole bunch of predators that are more abundant now.
Yeah.
So, but I used an analogy that seemed to resonate with some people that I was talking to about it. The predator habitat argument is sort of like I'm viewing it like a boat. You're on a boat in the ocean and it's taking on water. Well, if the boat has a hole in it, you can keep the boat afloat by paling water out as long as you keep up with that. You can keep it afloat indefinitely as long as you keep paling water out. It's not fixing the issue, right? And that's sort of what we're talking about with this habitat predator context. If the predator problem is an issue because of habitat, we're bailing water out instead of fixing the hole.
So I've got a question for you. I think that's a great analogy. Do you think there's a chance that feeding corn is making the hole bigger in your example?
I think it almost certainly is.
So
It's
it's
like,
making the leak in the boat bigger. So you're having to bail more.
yeah, yep. I think it's like we're trying to keep with analogies. It's like a magnifying glass on the hole.
We'll see how
Like
many
now
analogies
the
we can
hole
come up
looks,
with.
now the hole looks 10 times the size. Now,
Yeah.
I based on the evidence we have, it's still at hypothesis level.
Right.
But man, the evidence, we have a propensity of correlative evidence to suggest to me it's part of the problem. And as soon as we have data suggesting otherwise, then I'll be on here saying it.
Yeah.
I really hope it isn't a problem because man, it's going to be hard to get that genie back in the bottle.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. I
uh,
know.
and I would have loved for us to just been able to change the season and it fix everything, but you got to go with the data, and
Yeah.
I don't like it. It would be
Mhm.
awesome if that was the fix.
Right. One other thing that I wanted to make sure that we got to, because it's not something that we have talked about it several times on here, but it's not something that seems to be one of those recurring discussion points. But I think
I,
it should be
like you insisting we talk about corn.
is
I've been
it
taking on water because of
yeah,
I keep talking about it.
right.
You know what else I think we ought to talk about? Ryegrass, because
Yeah,
that's
let's talk
part of the
about
problem too.
ryegrass. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Um and ryegrass and corn can be implicated in what I'm about to say. But I Marcus, I'm really concerned that if at least part of what we're seeing with turkey populations is not related primarily to hen survival. So I feel like this low hen survival keeps getting brought up now from multiple perspectives and multiple researchers and biologists. But we're seeing, 50% and sometimes even lower annual hen survival in some of these studies.
Yeah,
And
Tennessee,
then,
Oklahoma.
and then Coulter from his separate analysis, he's Coulter Chitwood, it's actually Londe et al. Is the paper that it was in. But they showed that hen survival was the number one factor that was influencing turkey population growth.
We
And that's because you have to have hens to make eggs, right?
Yeah.
You have to have eggs to make poults. So
Well, and
I
that's not
wonder,
because we're shooting them.
right?
So what? And it gets us right back into the same thing, and we're gonna have it's sort of like when it's like a battlefield, and we're in the middle of it, and we have people on both sides of it shooting at each other.
Hmm.
We've got the predator folks and the habitat folks arguing over it, and the problem is we need data to show how to make hen survival go up.
Yes.
And we have really strong opinions that is predator removal, and we have really strong opinions that is habitat. And then we have a lot of people that are in the middle that think it's probably a combination,
Hmm.
and we don't have good data on any of those.
I think that both probably influence it to some degree, but we really need, like you said, we don't have data on either of them. We need data on both. And specifically, the data that we need is that gives us information on the effect size of each of those potential practices,
Yeah.
so that we can make determinations on how to most time and cost efficiently elicit the responses that
Yeah.
we're after. Right. So,
Here's a really important thing. We're going to get that data, but it's
hmm
going to take a while.
hmm
Because as far as I know, nobody's funded that experiment yet on
right.
either of those. So I don't think there's a causative experimental manipulation, thing going on right now.
No.
However, it's pretty safe to say, I think, and you can counter me if you think otherwise, improving nesting cover is probably not going to hurt.
No.
And neither is trapping coyotes. Probably not going to hurt. So I would suggest that you go out and improve nesting cover, because it also should influence coyote abundance and predation. And if you also want to trap coyotes, go do that. It won't
Mhm.
address the habitat problem, but it's a lot of fun,
Mhm.
and it's probably not going to hurt. So if I think we're pretty safe to suggest, that implementing some practices to decrease hen predation on the nest, which is the primary time that she's lost, is probably not going to hurt. We'll just
Mhm.
say that. I don't
Mhm.
know that's the problem. We don't know what it will confer
Yeah.
in the vital rate, but it's probably not going to make it worse.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny you brought that up because I was just having a conversation with a student. Can't remember if it was this morning or yesterday, but anyway, he was asking me, if there's not good nesting cover in the area that a hen occupies, how far will she go to find good nesting cover? And I said, I'm not really sure, but can you maybe give me more context so that I can understand where you're coming from on this? And he said, yeah, like, he hunts or owns property in an area that has extensive mature, hardwood forest, and there's no what he would consider quality nesting cover for miles. And I said, well, a hen's not going to go miles to find good
Yeah,
concealment cover for her nest. So she only
probably.
has available, probably, but she only, generally, if she's in an area that lacks any good nesting cover, she's just not going to nest in good nesting cover.
Yeah,
And I think that's an important point because if you have a study area that fits that description, then your conclusions about where hens prefer to nest are going to be off because a hen did not have an area available to her to choose to nest in that she would prefer,
yeah.
right?
We actually have some data. We'll just say, uh, to speak to this somewhat. I'm trying to think of how to couch this to be explicit, so that it's not confusing or misinterpreted. So we have done the analysis for Florida data, and the Oklahoma bunch has done it on their data, where we looked at where we trapped hens. So in other words, we
Hmm.
captured them during the winter and we put a tag on them. And then we looked at how far the nest was from where we captured them.
Hmm.
And it was pretty similar actually between studies, which we're doing it in preparation for a big experiment that will be multi-state that we're trying to get off the ground and funded right now. That is a
Hmm.
habitat manipulation. It's another one of these big topic areas, right? We're trying to address, but it's going to take some time to do that, especially in a causative experiment. But anyway, we wanted to know how big the study area need to be. So we need to catch hens and then have a reasonably high likelihood of nesting in our treatment area. And in the Florida population, I'm trying to convert it from kilometers to miles. If you want to know, then you
How many
can't.
miles is it?
Oh, well, I
Or how
remember
many? I'm sorry. How many
kilometers.
kilometers is it?
So it's like 90% of
You
the
know, I'm the math
hens.
expert on this podcast,
Yes.
so I'll help you out.
I've been seeing that in the comments on when people leave us a rating.
We got one on
Uh,
there for my former math teacher, didn't we?
that was awesome. Uh,
What was the
we ought to,
kilometers?
yeah. So 90% of the hens in Florida nested within 2 kilometers. I think is what it
Yeah,
worked out to, or
yeah.
it may have been 2.5 kilometers. So that's about what?
2.5 would be a mile and a half
Yeah.
because a
So
5K is 3 miles.
okay. Yeah. So most of the hens nest within a couple of miles of where they were caught.
Hmm.
Now that does
But there's also
not.
that shift in habitat use from when they're caught during the wintertime to spring breeding grounds.
That's true, and there's some degree of dispersal probably.
Right.
We have a lot of hens that will just kind of bebop around, and nearby where they were caught for a while, and then a week before they're going to nest, all of a sudden they pick up shop and go.
Yeah.
So, and if you go out west and to Rio or Miriam, there is data suggesting that might be literally dozens of miles
Mm-hmm.
between the winter and summer ground.
Right.
So here's the problem with that I was concerned might get misinterpreted. So let's just speak directly about it. It's not clear whether or not that is an intrinsic part of the population, so something that is in the population as a mechanism to disperse genetics
Mm-hmm.
or some other thing, or if it's partly due to selection, nest site selection, like what you were just saying. So in other words, they're probably not moving a mile to look for a good place to nest. They're probably moving a mile for something else intrinsically important to the population, like genetics, to disperse that.
Right.
And then finding a place to nest where they go to.
Yeah.
So and those are really important because, the mechanism is not to be conflated with management action, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what you're trying to accomplish, if indeed that behavior is because the hen is getting away from other hens that she's related to,
Mm-hmm.
and then nesting there, well, your action is try to provide the best nesting stuff that you can,
Mm-hmm.
and some hens are going to use it when they get there,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
As opposed to you improving all the nesting cover on your property because you're trying to keep all of them on your property.
Mm-hmm.
You're probably receiving them from somewhere else
Mm-hmm.
often.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So, but that's something we don't have good data on, and we'll get from this habitat manipulation that I'm really excited about is we'll know how far hens move generally from where they're captured to where they nest, and we'll know if improving habitat at a large scale is changing how far they go to find a good place to nest.
Right.
So
It's good
that being
stuff.
said, if a hen leaves her regular winter range to go somewhere to nest and she gets there and now there's no good nesting cover around,
Mm-hmm.
well, she'll probably, I mean, we see nests all the time in weird places, right? She
Yeah.
might just lay it in the middle of the woods up against a tree.
Yeah.
With no
I'm
cover.
still not convinced that they make the best decisions about where to nest, so I want to make it
Yeah.
I want to make it so that they have to make a good decision on
Right.
the places that I manage.
That's a good way to think about it. Make sure that you have good nesting cover available often, and some hens will end up in it whether they select it or not.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a good way to look at it.
So we've gone down a lot of paths today. Is there any stone that we've left unturned on this discussion?
Well, I like when Craig did it. It was like, we hadn't talked about fire hardly at all.
Well, we just talked about habitat and the importance of providing good nesting, which, fire is a fundamental part of. So we'll check that box off.
Yeah. Well, I think the habitat / predator issue is an important one. We know a lot of turkeys get eaten at each life stage, but we don't know why the predator context has changed. But we do have strong evidence that the habitat context has changed substantially, and it's also changed in ways that probably benefit predators.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes it really unclear what action should be taken to fix the problem. And we need to, it's like, I feel like people think that we're just trying to prove that we're needed, by saying we need the experiments, but we need it for the resource. And let me tell you what, if I get a big project funded, that's more work for me.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't make my life better.
Yeah.
It makes it more stressful and I have more to do and everything, but I want the information so I can confer that.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm padding my pockets with grant money.
Yeah.
So, we do need data to show causative relationships for habitat manipulation and predator removal. And ideally we'd have them in a fully factorial design, which is just a fancy way of saying that we would try trapping in one place, we'd have a control that has nothing, we'd have habitat in one place, and then we'd have the two together.
Hmm.
So we now know what is doing nothing. How does that compare to doing one or the other or both together? And we need that
So,
replicated over long term.
so I was kind of recapping and making sure that there wasn't anything else that we needed to discuss, and you went back to habitat and predation and didn't mention anything about season dates. So, are you saying, by leaving that out of your kind of concluding discussion points, are you saying that you have moved past the season date hypothesis? Or I mean, do
unless
you think it's settled, or would you
unless
like to
there's
see the
un,
Tennessee study replicated?
I think that would be fine. It's better if it's replicated in multiple places.
Yeah, I would
But
agree.
as it relates to the biology of the animal, I don't see why it wouldn't apply. What was done in Tennessee wouldn't apply to whatever other place, as
I just
long as
feel
it
like
if
there's
it aligns with the biology of the animal the same way, and the context is the same in terms of male harvest rate. I don't see why you wouldn't find the same thing.
yeah, under the harvest regimes that are common across the eastern subspecies range, and then you overlay that with all of the potential compensatory mechanisms that we've talked about that can specifically compensate for male harvest. It just doesn't seem very probable that, change in our
Yeah,
season is going to have a huge effect on reproduction. And once again, to reiterate, no one's ever proven that it has.
yeah. Well, and if there is strong data presented
Yeah.
that's competing with that at a level at the same level of rigor, then we'll cover it. But I haven't seen that, so I'm going with the data.
Hmm.
As I'm currently stand, the data from multiple angles, not just the strong experiment in Tennessee,
Yeah.
uh, from multiple angles just doesn't line up with it.
Yeah.
So that doesn't mean that 5 years down the road we won't be provided compelling evidence to show that we were wrong. But we're going with the best data available, and that suggests this isn't the problem.
Yeah, and I think we need to make sure that we extend that same thought process to all the other hypotheses too. Um, some people have called us out and think that we're willing to stretch the data further when it comes to habitat, and concluding that a lot of the declines that we're seeing are related to it, even though we don't have that cause and effect study like you mentioned,
Mhm.
that explicitly concluded that. However, we do know that improving habitat influences pretty much every single aspect of a species survival and reproduction.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty safe place to land, say
Yep.
thinking that it's habitat. But that being said, I don't know you know, that habitat is 100%. I'm still not saying that it's 100% responsible for the declines in harvest that we're seeing in many places in the eastern subspecies range, because I get confronted all the time with very perplexing scenarios that are anecdotal, right? But
Mhm.
people that I trust have shared with me about areas that have remained relatively unchanged from a habitat perspective, and these are biologists and foresters that know, they're
That's high
aware of
qu yeah.
what changes look like. There's not changes happening under their nose that they're unaware of, but these people have seen in those areas flocks of 50, 60 turkeys disappear all of a sudden, like from one year to the next. And they ask me, well, what happened there? Habitat obviously cannot have degraded that quickly, over that kind of time span to
Yeah.
result in that population decline. And those people suggested something else, like maybe there's an outbreak of a disease in that area.
Mhm.
And I think that that's really interesting too. And I think it's important for us to understand that from a mechanistic perspective, because it gives us the knowledge that we can go forward and say, well, this is what's happening, this is why it's happening. But then the next step, of course, is to figure out how we can address it.
Yeah.
Well, how are you going to address unless there's some practice that's directly contributing to disease that we can cease. So maybe feeding is contributing. Maybe we find that out years down the road, and so we can address that directly. But if it's not, then what do we do? Like, we can't vaccinate turkeys across the entire Southeast. So how do you buffer against it? Let's just say that hen mortality, we find out in a few years, hen mortality is greater because of some disease agent. Well, really the only thing that I know to do to address that is to improve habitat quality, right?
Yeah, or stop doing stuff like feeding. I think the disease
Well, I
one is,
tried to put that caveat in
yeah.
there about,
Yeah, I know. I'm just saying, I think the disease issue is a valid one and concerning also because, at least with infectious disease, it could be a scenario like you're saying. It could be like everything's doing well as far as we can tell, and then next year there's no turkeys. Like that's what happens with disease outbreaks. Like you have a substantial die off of a population, potentially. Not that isn't always what happens, obviously,
I mean,
but
I
it
hear,
can happen.
I have people contact me saying they found 12 dead turkeys in 1 year.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem is things look to be fine, and then until they aren't,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a question of why? Like, are we creating a context that's making turkeys more vulnerable to that event?
Right.
Right? Not just that we're promoting disease prevalence. It may just be that we are weakening the population's ability to deal with it. Right, which could be linked to habitat or feeding or probably other agents, contaminants. Like there's we don't know all of the ways that we
Yeah, I
could
mean,
be
I'm sure there's,
facilitating it, but it certainly is a possibility, and I think it's a concerning one. The other
yeah,
problem with disease is which turkey gets eaten, the one that's sick.
absolutely.
So it was the disease problem would likely be hidden from us, especially for
Yeah.
something like blackhead. Where the turkey's good today and dead tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be hard to find that. So people have pointed out multiple times that we're not just finding dead turkeys laying around, right? So I think that's a good point.
In some cases, we are finding dead
Yeah,
turkeys laying
some
around.
cases, yes, but there's also plenty of people who are like, "Hey,
Yeah.
I'm not like our population isn't doing well, and we're not finding dead turkeys laying around." That's a
Right.
common rebuttal to the feeding discussion.
I
So
think all of us, and I include myself in this when I say us, absolutely. Uh, I have periods where I think I get too fixated on single solutions.
yeah, the reality is it's almost certainly a myriad of problems.
And I think we have to caution ourselves against that because it is very attractive and comforting to hone in on one thing, that this is my pet thing, that this is going to fix the problem.
Yeah,
And I would say, habitat management is probably, it's not going to hurt things, right? And it's needed. It's needed in the vast majority of areas. And I think there's probably areas that maybe have a predator problem too that needs to be addressed with trapping. And I think there's areas that primarily their problems stem from diseases. And then the relative ratios, or the relative importance of each of those factors likely changes geographically across the landscape.
and
And
over
that's
time.
why we have to, yeah, and over time. And so, as hard as it is sometimes, we need to try to, defend ourselves against getting sucked into that mentality that it's a single solution problem.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, there's some folks online that see it differently than that.
I know.
Man, we're catching that. Court. Apparently, we all should be just ashamed of ourselves. We should have just asked, a couple of people online that already have the answers. We
Isn't
should
it
be
funny?
ashamed of spending all this money on research to try to get objective data.
I'll go ahead and say it is what it is. I'll call it out right now, but it's so arrogant, right? It's so arrogant for people to come on and criticize us for covering a study that was, very well designed and replicated.
Yeah, to
And they,
address something that is literally affecting their
yeah,
opportunity.
yeah,
Do you not want to know definitively, is this the answer or not?
and they have the arrogance to say, you didn't need to do that. All you needed to do was call me, pick up the phone,
Good Lord.
Oh my God. I can't imagine.
Yep.
I wish it were that simple. I wish there was a man that we could call.
Yep. Well, I'm sure that people are going to continue to tell us how it is and how dumb we are for not knowing that.
Yeah, that's right.
So, but we're going to continue to cover the best data available, and it's like the season timing. If we change the harvest rate from 30% to 80%, that might change everything.
Yeah.
So right now the data doesn't support it, and that doesn't mean it won't ever, but it doesn't right now. So I think we do have strong data to suggest habitat quality has declined precipitously, and predation is the leading cause of mortality. So those are still viable.
Yeah.
And what we should do about it is what's up for debate.
Yeah, that's the thing is, what do we do going forward? I mean, if I'm king for a day, it's going to be such a huge surprise to everyone, but I'm putting money into well-funded experimental research projects that are going to manipulate factors that we think, that are behind our leading hypotheses. And I'm going to try to develop that cause and effect data, and I'm going to try to figure out the mechanisms. How is this affecting
Mm-hmm.
populations?
Yeah, and
And
under what context? Like, how does the context change the relative importance of those?
absolutely.
Man, that's good stuff. And somebody online is going to tell you how you wasted all of everybody's time and money.
They might be right.
Yeah, well, we're doing our best,
If it's not good enough, it's not our fault. We're working with what God gave us.
Yeah, who made us the scientist?
Nobody else wanted to do it. I guess we were the biggest suckers.
Yeah, well, maybe so. I've heard you say something along these lines. I'm always in these discussions with scientists all the time, and I'm just like, what? How am I here? These people are so much smarter than me.
They know it too.
Yeah.
You don't have to tell them.
I know. It's just assumed that everyone knows.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think that's all I've got.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate the support out there. It's hard, especially with issues like we've just covered. It's hard for us to do that because we know no matter what, we're going to get ridicule. So it's hard to be in that position, but somebody has to do it, and we're trying our best to deliver the most objective information that we can to you, and we appreciate the support from those who are supporting us.
Yeah. Yes,
So,
we do. I think we have some exciting episodes coming up that folks will be really interested in. So we're kind of rounding the corner of turkey season, at least here in
mhm.
the deep South. I know there's some other states that are still going strong, but um, as folks' minds turn to summertime and habitat management, we're going to have several of those episodes here coming up. Some stuff about food plotting and some stuff about invasive species. We've got several episodes in the hopper right now that I think land managers, landowners are going to be
Yeah.
super interested in.
Yeah, we also have an update coming from
Yeah,
a new part of the wild turkey range
that's
that
right.
has been asked for a few times, but also they'll be in full swing in their season when it
Yeah,
comes out. So we have to. I kind of get sucked into this because, especially being in Florida, where we start early and end early relative to the most of the range. We've already moved on from turkeys here, but there are folks in a lot of places that are just starting.
Yeah.
Or just about to start.
Yeah. So we're going to take y'all to the Great Plains region.
Yeah. So that'll be good stuff. Yeah, lots of great episodes coming. So stay tuned, folks.
Stay tuned. I've always wanted to say that.
All right. Well.
All right. Appreciate everyone's support. And if these last couple of episodes have resonated with you, or you think they're important for other folks to hear, one way you can help us do that is by leaving a rating and review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. So if you've done that, we really appreciate it. If you haven't, please go do so. And like I said, help us get it out there.
Yeah.
Appreciate your support.
For some of you may not be aware, we are, I think, in near real time. We're putting the episodes up on YouTube, and sometimes folks like to share those more. If you're looking for a clip from this that you want to share with somebody, it's accessible there as well. All right. Go teach somebody something, Will.
I'll try.
My class is starting in a couple of weeks, so
yeah.
You'll be concluding about the time that I'm starting.
We've got a unit this afternoon on spreading corn.
Yeah, that's a good one.
All the different types of spreaders you can use.
Yeah. Is it seriously, are you teaching habitat management?
Yeah, so what we're doing this week is we're using, they're learning the tools and techniques right now to look at forest condition impact on bird communities.
Okay.
So they're learning specifically, like they're going out to these stands and collecting veg data and collecting bird data, and they're looking at, why do certain birds occur in certain areas? It's kind of the fundamental question of habitat, right?
Yeah.
And so then we take it a step further and we look at the practices that have been implemented in those stands where those birds occur. And so that's how they start putting the pieces together as far as, species habitat connections and how we can manage that.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Yep, I'm teaching very similar topic, probably in a different context than you because it's in a different system, I think. But same kind of stuff.
I'm only about 30 minutes north of the Florida line right now.
Oh, are you in Open Pine, Savannah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah,
so we're probably doing the same thing then.
Yeah, we're gonna go. I mean, we're in Gallberry country down here. So, and we get into you go a little bit further south onto the national forest down here, Conecuh. It's kind of the general area that we're in, and you can get to some flatwoods. Mm-hmm. So, pretty similar system.
Yeah. Well, I'll be in the Red Hills region,
yeah.
So that's my habitat course. We live at Tall Timbers for a couple of weeks and do the same sort of stuff, and they get some hands-on experience with habitat management, like prescribed burning, for example.
Yeah. Our students got the opportunity to hook up a 3-point hitch yesterday to a tractor, and then they got their first opportunity to drive a tractor yesterday.
Yeah, good.
So they really love that.
Yeah, we drive a tractor and a dozer and sometimes some other things as well. A skid steer last year.
Yeah.
So
I always try to get them out and burn, of course.
Yeah. Run a chainsaw. We do that. We do.
I hadn't been that brave yet.
we do some hack and squirt.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. So getting hands-on experience for our next generation of biologists that are going to be taking care of our resources.
Yeah. Cool.
Yep. All right.
See you, man.
See you later.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.